Good afternoon. Thank you. It is really wonderful to be here. I was here for a little bit of the week last year. I wasn't able to come to the culminating, this big thing here, which is what I had hoped to be. But so I'm here this year, and it is great to see everybody out there. I come to this presentation actually through some of the struggles in my life, and might not be the struggles that you are thinking of. The struggle that is the first for me is being an African child who is exceedingly literally minded. So when somebody says to me, 1 + 1 = 2, that is truth. And I'm going to stick with it. And for an African child, that might not be the greatest gift that you have, because our lessons are taught to us through Proverbs. And if you are literal-minded, Proverbs do not make sense. So I grew up hearing things from my grandparents and parents, things such as when I was faced with a huge hurdle, my grandmother would say to me, "The elephant never finds its own trunk too heavy." Who has been talking to the elephants? And which elephant in particular told you that his trunk was never too heavy? Or one of my favorites, the child who doesn't cry dies on its mother's back. What? So this woman took a child, put the child on her back, and then forgot. Completely forgot that she had another human being on her back until that person started crying. Now, I have carried my children on my back. Let me tell you, those people kick, they spit up on your back. They don't need to cry. You cannot forget that there is another human being on your back. And so when somebody said that, was like, that is stupid. That is really stupid. And my grandmother explained to me that, what we are trying to teach you is that the person who is silent in the face of oppression and evil sets up themselves to be victims of oppression and evil. So that was my struggle, was getting these words of wisdom to make sense in my own life. Looking at the lives of people who I thought were amazing human beings. My grandmothers, my mother's mother and my father's mother, were both uneducated women and were both domestic workers. But for me, there were no people on the planet as amazing as those two women. Those women could take a small amount of food and make it magically feed not just our family, but anybody who happened to knock on the door. Those women looked at me and let me know that what apartheid was teaching me, that what apartheid was saying to me, that as a black girl, I was less than, was a huge lie. And they managed to tell me that in the way that they lived their lives. Now, my mother's mother worked for a family in Krugersdorp where we had grown up, but then we left and we would come back and visit, and we would often come back, arrive in Krugersdorp around the time that she was going to be getting off work. And so we would go and pick her up at her place of work. What you have to understand that in our culture, anybody older than you is worthy of respect. simply for the fact that they have been on the planet longer. And so we are raised that we don't even call our older brothers and sisters by their first name, that we put in front of their name an honorific that means big brother or big sister. So you can imagine that my grandmothers were people so much older, so much more experience, so much wisdom. And went to pick up my grandmother from the home where she worked, and I heard the children in that house calling her Joanna. Hey, Joanna, before you leave, you need to do this for me. And I looked at these kids who were my age, and I was so angry. I was so angry at them for disrespecting this woman who meant so much to me. But I was also really, really angry at her for allowing that. And so when we were in the car on the way home, I said to her, how can you let them treat you like that? How can you let them speak to you like that? How can you let them demean you in such a way? And she said to me, you know, the measure of your worth in the world is not how others treat you, but how you carry yourself and how you treat others. And that, on that day, I have to tell you the truth, on that day I was like, yeah, blah, 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 okay. Seriously? Seriously? That's your response? But as I have grown older, that has been one of the central things that has allowed me to be in the world. That growing up under apartheid, where I couldn't even live at home and get the kind of education my parents wanted us to have, because the black schools in South Africa offered such a poor type of education that I was sent to boarding school when I was 6.5 in a neighboring country. To be raised in a country that said that because I was black, there were certain jobs that, not that I could not simply apply for, that there was no way I could ever qualify for. That when I was growing up, you know, they said that black people couldn't be long-distance bus drivers, that we didn't have the skill set to be long-distance bus drivers. So I was growing up in a system that told me that I lacked a lot of what it needed to be human. But I had this community of people who said to me, we live because we know apartheid is not the final answer. And so we live our lives for the world that we are preparing. So we would come home from school with our reports, and our report cards did not just end up in our home. I mean, it wasn't just my parents who read the report cards. Everybody in the community got to see your report card. At the end of term, you went up and down the street showing off your report card. Showing off for some, because if you did really well, you would walk into homes and you would walk out with money and candy. Or, my experience, you would walk into homes and walk out with many lectures about how you were not living up to your potential. And my initial response would be, why would I even try? There were no opportunities for me to strive for positions, professions that I might imagine, because apartheid has closed those doors to me. And our community, our parents, our neighbors would say, apartheid is not the end of the story. What we are wanting you to prepare yourself for is for the country, the world we know is going to exist. A world that needs educated Black women. A world that is going to need you to be able to lead countries, companies, churches. Yeah, churches is a big one. Churches is a big one where I come from. I mean, apart from my dad, that just rubbed off on him from my grandmother, because my grandmother should have been the first female Archbishop of Canterbury, actually, because she was in church constantly. And she was the one who determined in our family when you were old enough to sit through a church service. So Sunday school in our community was so much fun because all we did at Sunday school was learn gospel songs and really fun gospel songs. And then there were women outside the church selling ice and candy. And so during the service, that's what we were doing, practicing our songs and buying ice and candy with our collection money. And then we would go into the church at the end of the service and sing to the adults. So that was really fun. But the day my grandmother said to me, "You are old enough to come and sit through the service," I felt as though I had been crowned. I felt as though I had been ordained. I felt as though I had been called by Jesus Christ himself to sit at the right hand of the throne. I was bored as heck for that hour and a half I was in church, but I was proud. And part of what she conveyed to me at that time was because at that time in our churches, girls could not even serve at the altar. And we would look and all these boys are walking around, doing the incense and stuff and doing all that bowing. And it looked like fun, especially the incense. When they start whirling that thing, it's like, looked like fun. I was like, I want to do that. But our church said girls could not be servers. And my grandmother said, that's not the end of the story. Don't look at what you see today and accept that as the conclusion of any story. What you need to do is look at what you dream. Look at what you dream for, about, and prepare yourself for that world. It sounds amazing now when I think back that I kept hearing this. Because at the time, it didn't sound like it was going to do anything in the world. But as I have looked back on my life, it's amazing to me how much of what those old women told me about the right way of living, how doors have opened, how situations have changed, how opportunities that I never imagined have come to pass. And so that is the main lesson that I tell my children. I say, don't look at the world today as being the definition of who you are or who you can be. Go into yourself and dream the world that you dream. What is it that you want to see in the world? And live that life. Now, I've tried to do that in my own life, and there have been times when it has been truly a struggle. In particular with my middle child, my daughter Mungi, who was born with an attitude. That child came out saying, "My way." And there were times when I would look at her and I would think, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to lock this child in a closet until she's 24. But then those voices came back to me about a young, determined, confident Black woman is what I want to raise. And if that is the world that I see, if that is the person I imagine her to be when she is 24, I need now at 3 to be the one allowing her to practice that confidence, that attitude, that knowledge that she is beautiful and can achieve." Just last week, I received a letter from my son. I hadn't planned to talk about this, but last week I received a letter from my son, and he wrote this letter. I mean, he was required to write this letter. So that part, that part we'll let slide. But so he was required to write this letter as part of pledging his fraternity, and it was, you need to write a letter to your parents, thanking them for raising you and getting you to this point in your life. But there was a part in the letter where he said, "What I always remember about you is that you have always been surrounded with what I think is a multitude of friends, people from different walks of life. And that is my dream for my children, that I will surround them with diverse people so that they will have a knowledge of the world, that they will have different perspectives on the world, that they will have different ideas and think different ways about our world." And I thought, that is amazing. I have succeeded at one thing. And I have to tell you that a couple of years ago, this young man said to his sister, "That woman thinks she's a dictator, that she runs everything." So, you never know. You never know. But what, for me, has been truly key has been believing that it is not just okay to dream, that it is imperative to dream. And again, it goes back to those 2 women I talked about at the beginning, my grandmothers. I told you that my mother's mother was a domestic worker. Well, she became a domestic worker after she was widowed and because of apartheid laws was thrown off the farm that she and her husband had worked because as a Black woman, she could not own property. And so she became a domestic worker with 3 children. And she sent my mother to boarding school. Now that sounds bizarre in and of itself, but what is particularly strange is that my mother says, I didn't realize it at the time, but all my classmates were the children of doctors and lawyers and nurses, the professions that were open to Black people in the Black community. And my mother was a domestic worker. And so I asked my grandmother, I said, how did you do that? I mean, how and why did you do that? And she said, after I got thrown off the farm, I said that the world I want to live in is one where I know my daughter will have options beyond being a domestic worker. And that meant that I went to that convent and I begged those nuns to take my child and said I would do whatever they needed me to do to make that happen. And I went to my family and I went to my priest and I went to everybody I knew and asked them to give something towards my daughter's education. Because the world I dreamed was a world where my daughter would be able to choose what her life was going to be. When I was 34, South Africa had its first democratic election. I voted for the first time in my life, 34 years of age. My grandmother voted for the first time in her life, 91 years of age. After the election, after we had voted, and I have to tell you just very quickly this about the election. So there was concern that people were going to be intimidated about their votes. And so there was a whole campaign around telling people that your vote is your secret, that it doesn't matter what people tell you, that they don't know what you write once you're in that ballot room. And so there was, your vote is your secret. And so I was going to a rural community to be an election observer. And so I said to my grandmother, okay, I'm leaving. So you can tell me who you're going to vote for. You can tell me who you're going to vote for. She goes, my vote is my secret. I was like, okay, lady. And then to make it worse, my cousin who took her to vote said as soon as she came out of the ballot place, she was like, I voted for Mandela, I voted for Mandela. Told the whole world, except me. So it was a secret from me only. But so after we had voted, we were back at home, and she said to me, do you remember when you were growing up, I told you apartheid is not the end of the story? Do you remember when you were growing up, I told you this system was going to end in your lifetime? But imagine what greatness it feels for me that it ended in mine. And if there was ever any doubt in my mind about living the world that we want to see, that conversation with my grandmother, who never got to vote again, she died a couple of years later, but who lived to see the world that she had prepared her grandchildren for, who lived to see a world in which being a Black woman wasn't a sign of shame. That removed any doubt in my mind. That if we are to live fully, we have to live the dreams of the world that we have. And so that is one of the reasons that I continue to speak about racial and gender justice, because part of my dream is a world where my daughters can walk anywhere, in any city, at any time, day and night, and not fear assault, and not be asked, what were you doing there? And not be asked, what were you wearing? Why had you been drinking? And so, for me, the world that I am living is a world where my daughters are completely free and safe. And it's not the world that we are living in today, but it won't be that world unless enough of us start living that world. Start living that world by teaching our sons to respect our daughters and other people's daughters. The world I dream is a world where my son, who is not an amazing child, is not a horrific child, is an 18-year-old boy will be able to walk the world as a young man and be seen and judged on his actions, not the color of his skin. And that's not the world we live in. I know. I sobbed hearing the story of Trayvon Martin. I sobbed hearing the story of Tamir Rice. But that is the world I dream and that I am living towards. And it will become a reality if enough of us say enough. Enough of mothers burying their children. So I ask you, what is the world that you are dreaming? And I ask you, start living it today. Thank you.